Hi, welcome to my latest video in my Questions About Anne Boleyn series, which is all about answering questions that Anne Boleyn Files followers sent to me about Anne Boleyn. I'm Claire Ridgway, by the way. I run the Anne Boleyn Files website. I'm also author of several books on Anne Boleyn, just so you know a little bit about me if you haven't been watching my videos. Okay, in today's instalment, I'm going to be looking at the idea that Anne Boleyn was sent away from her family home of Hever Castle in Kent in England to the continent because of her scandalous behaviour. Now, I bet that's got you intrigued. Now, I started to receive questions about this idea back in 2011, and I was a bit bemused. I was wondering where on earth people were getting the idea that Anne Boleyn had done something really scandalous and had to be sent off, had to be exiled off to get rid of her. And finally someone told me that they'd read this in the blurb for a recent book on Anne Boleyn, Josephine Wilkinson's book, Anne Boleyn, the Young Queen-to-be. Now here is an excerpt from the blurb, just so you can see what I mean. Anne Boleyn is perhaps the most engaging of Henry VIII's queens. For her, he would divorce his wife of some 20 years' standing. He would take on the might of the Roman Church and the Holy Roman Empire. He would even alienate his own people in order to win her favour and eventually her hand. But before Henry came into her life, Anne Boleyn had already wandered down love's winding path. She'd learned its twists and turns during her youth spent at the courts of the Low Countries and France, where she'd been sent as a result of her scandalous behaviour with her father's butler and chaplain. What? I can hear you saying that through the miles, through the ether. What? I don't even know how to respond to that. I mean, sigh, facepalm, headbang. Where on earth does that idea come from? Well, before I talk about the origin of this myth, and I can promise you it really is a myth. It has no basis in fact. I just want to point out that all of the queries that I received about this, none of this is historian Josephine Wilkinson's fault. She does not give any credence to this myth. She did not write the blurb for her book. And in her book, she actually talks about this myth. She just dedicates one paragraph to it and dismisses it as untrue. But obviously her publisher or her editor or someone has kind of zoned in on this this story as being salacious, as being something that might entice someone looking at the back of the book or someone looking at it on Amazon or something. It might entice them to buy it, to find out what on earth this is all about. But oh dear, it's caused quite a lot of controversy instead. So where on earth does this story come from? Well, it comes from our favourite chappie, our favourite anti-Boleyn propagandist, Nicholas Sander, who you may remember if you've been watching my other videos. You may remember him from the video I did on whether or not Anne Boleyn miscarried a deformed fetus in January 1536. Also my video on whether Anne Boleyn had an extra finger, 6 fingers on one hand, because he's the man that all of these sort of anti-Boleyn propaganda myths come from. He was a man, as I've explained before, who was a Catholic recusant in exile in Elizabeth I's reign. So he'd been forced to leave the country because of his Catholic faith. And he wrote his book, Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, which was all about the Reformation. And he was aiming to blacken Elizabeth I's reputation. And he was attacking her parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, who he held responsible for the break with Rome, the subsequent Protestant Reformation, and really the troubles of the Catholics in England. Now, in his book, this is what Sander writes. At 15, she, that's Anne Boleyn, sinned first with her father's butler and then with his chaplain, and forthwith was sent to France and placed at the expense of the king under the care of a certain nobleman not far from Brie. Soon afterwards, she appeared at the French court, where she was called the English mare because of her shameless behaviour, and then the royal mule when she became acquainted with the King of France. And obviously, acquainted isn't really just, her getting to know the King of France. It's acquainted in a little bit more of an intimate way, is what he's hinting at there. Oh boy, there is so much wrong with that little paragraph from Sander's work that it's hard to know where to begin. But we can dismiss this story, which Sander just states as fact. He doesn't say that, he's just repeating gossip or making something up. He says it as fact, but we can dismiss it for the following reasons. Okay, first reason. Anne did not leave England for France. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, secured her a position in the household of Margaret of Austria in the Low Countries, and Anne started her time on the continent, serving in the household of Margaret of Austria and finishing her education there in the summer of 1513. Before moving on to France, she got recalled from Margaret of Austria's court by her father. Her father wrote a letter to Margaret of Austria explaining that Anne had been chosen to serve Mary Tudor, Queen of France. But she wasn't Queen of France then, she was travelling to France to become Queen of France. Mary Tudor was, of course, the sister of Henry VIII. So Anne had been chosen to serve her. So Anne was recalled from her position in Margaret of Austria's court and had to move on to France, which she did in late 1514. Anne stayed on in France after King Louis XII's death, which meant that Mary Tudor moved back to England. But Anne stayed on. She'd been chosen to serve Queen Claude, who was the new Queen of France, being Queen Consort to King Francis I. And Anne stayed in France from 1515 to 1521. So she'd originally gone there in 1514 to serve Mary Tudor, stayed on and served Queen Claude from 1515 to late 1521, when she was recalled to England. Another reason we can dismiss this is Anne was never based in Brie with a nobleman. According to the records, she went to Margaret of Austria's court, then the French court, and she would have spent time also in the chateaux of the Loire Valley, such as Amboise and Blois, where she would have accompanied Queen Claude, who retired from the royal court when she was pregnant and giving birth. So there is nothing in the records to show that Anne actually spent time with a nobleman in Brie. She was serving Queen Claude. Another reason is there is no suggestion of any scandal surrounding her departure from England. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, had organised a very prestigious appointment for her at the court of Margaret of Austria, who was a very pious woman who had high morals and who would not have been interested in taking a girl into her household who had any scandal connected to her at all. There is just no way that Thomas Boleyn could have secured that appointment for Anne if Anne had been a young girl who had been having affairs with her father's chaplain and butler. Absolutely no way. Another reason we can dismiss this is it's just not accurate. Anne was not 15 when she left England. Depending on which date of birth you go with, the popular ones being 1501 or 1507, Anne was either around 12 when she left England for the continent, or she was 6. So that's how old she was when she went to join Margaret of Austria's court. She was not 15. There is also no other source for this myth. There's no corroboration for Sandra's story at all. There is also no scandal surrounding Anne during her time at the French court. You know, Sandra was saying there that Anne got a reputation as an English mare and, a royal mule, that her scandalous behaviour carried on in France. Well, there's no suggestion of that in the English or French sources. Lancelot de Carl, who was secretary to the French ambassador, he wrote of Anne's time in France in a poem he wrote on Anne Boleyn's life and death. He wrote, "At that time, given that she was young when she came to court, she sagely listened to the ladies in waiting, striving hard to imitate them the best way she could." Then he also wrote of her acquiring qualities and exquisite graces at the French court, and being filled with so many qualities, with honesty and accomplished graces. So that doesn't sound like a woman who was known for, sleeping around and having a scandalous reputation. And I'm sure that Lancelot de Carl, having been in France at the time, would surely have heard of her reputation if she had one, and would have repeated the scandal in his poem about her, seeing as his poem was written after her fall and execution. The only scandal he really talks about in his poem is, her becoming connected with Henry VIII, and then, of course, the scandal surrounding her fall. Then we have the fact that it was actually Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, who was referred to as the English mare. And Rodolfo Pio, the Bishop of Faenza, wrote that the French king knew Mary to be una grandissima ribalda et infame sopra tutte, a great prostitute and infamous above all. He was writing that. They were saying this about Mary Boleyn, trying to blacken Mary's name. These were not names and words associated with Anne. Now, William Rastall, who wrote a biography of Sir Thomas More in the 16th century, which is a very pro-Catholic, pro-Thomas More book, wrote of how Anne Boleyn was sent to France, where she behaved herself so licentiously, I don't know how you say that she was vulgarly called the Hackney of England, till being adopted to that king's familiarity, she was termed his mule. Now, Rastall was writing, as I say, a sympathetic biography of Sir Thomas More, and very pro-Catholic, and he wasn't at all sympathetic to the Boleyns. And what he writes there is not backed up by any contemporary French or English sources. Now, I wonder, by the language of Rastall's writing there, whether Sander used Rastall as a source. Sander was writing in the 1580s, so a long time after, Anne Boleyn had died, sort of nearly 50 years after she'd been executed. And obviously, Rastall, I think, was writing in the 1550s, so he was an earlier source than Sander. So I do wonder if Sander was relying on him for a source. And Lord Herbert, in his 17th century work, Life of Henry VIII, actually writes of how Nicholas Sander reports stories from William Rastall's book on More, such as also the idea that Anne Boleyn was actually the king's daughter by Elizabeth Howard, wife of Thomas Boleyn. So making out that Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's relationship was incestuous because Anne Boleyn was actually King Henry VIII's daughter. Another scandalous story that has no basis, in fact. So I do think that Sander was using Rastall's story on Anne's reputation and then embellishing it further. Another reason why we can dismiss it, Sander's story, is that it really is just a work of propaganda, and there are many, many inaccuracies in his work, so he can't be relied on. So at the end of the day, I've given you lots of reasons there why this story of her scandalous behaviour, why this story of her sleeping with her father's chaplain and butler, cannot be taken as fact. And we have to not only just take it with a pinch of salt or a hefty dose of salt, we can actually throw it out of the window and not believe it. Anne Boleyn was not sent away due to bad behaviour. She was sent to Margaret of Austria's court to finish her education. It was an absolutely wonderful opportunity that was given to her by her father, Thomas Boleyn, who was a very enlightened man, a humanist man who believed in educating his daughters to a high standard, just like boys were educated. So it was a wonderful opportunity, not a punishment for scandalous behaviour. I hope you've enjoyed today's talk. I'd love to hear your views on this, so please do leave comments. You can subscribe to my channel by just clicking there, and you can hit the bell to be notified of new videos, because I'm going to be doing these questions about Anne Boleyn videos on a regular basis. You can of course check out all of the other videos that I've already done in the questions about Anne Boleyn playlist. And now I'm going to give a little bit of a cheeky shout out, so please do forgive me. But if you are interested in finding out more about Anne Boleyn, there is of course the Anne Boleyn Files website and my books. But I've also put together an online history course, which can be found on medievalcourses.com, and I'll actually give you a link to my course, which is called The Life of Anne Boleyn, and it's totally online, so you can do it from anywhere in the world, and it has no set start date and end date, so you can do it whenever you want. You can do it in your spare time, you can do a few lessons, then leave it when life gets in the way, as life does, and take it up after. But it's video lessons which you can watch, or you can also listen to them as audio lessons, and it just takes you through Anne Boleyn's whole life. So I'll give you a link to that if you are interested in that, and you can check that out. Anyway, thanks for bearing with me, and thank you for being interested in my work. I will see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.